He was just a janitor, a single father working nights to support his young daughter, mopping floors in the gleaming headquarters of Harrington Enterprises. Jack Miller kept his head down, did his work, and stayed invisible until the night he accidentally walked into a high-level meeting. $18 billion hung in the balance as Victoria Harrington, the notoriously cold CEO known as the Ice Queen of Wall Street, publicly humiliated and fired him on the spot. What she didn't know was that behind Jack's humble uniform lay the brilliant financial mind who would soon uncover the devastating flaw in her company's biggest merger. A flaw that would bring her empire crashing down unless she could swallow her pride and admit she had judged him all wrong. Eleanor Wells moved through her sun-drenched kitchen with practiced efficiency, arranging fresh-cut flowers in a crystal vase while mentally reviewing the evening's dinner party details. At 52, she embodied understated elegance. Honey blonde hair cut in a simple shoulder-length style, minimal makeup enhancing her still striking features, and a wardrobe of well-made classics that never drew attention but never disappointed. Visitors to the Wells household invariably commented on the warm atmosphere Eleanor created, the immaculate presentation of every meal, the thoughtful touches that made guests feel special. What they didn't see were the 3 advanced degrees gathering dust or the literary analyses once praised by renowned scholars, now buried in boxes in the attic. On the refrigerator door hung a family photo from last Christmas, Eleanor slightly off-center, as if the photographer had been more concerned with capturing her husband Robert's distinguished silver temples and confident smile, or their daughter Elise's striking resemblance to her father, or their son Michael's recent law school acceptance. Eleanor's eyes in the photo held something the camera had accidentally preserved, a flicker of question, of absence despite physical presence. Tucked behind this photo was another image, visible only when Eleanor opened the refrigerator, herself at 26, standing proudly outside a university library, arms full of research materials, eyes alight with purpose and possibility. Eleanor brushed her fingers against this hidden photo now as she retrieved ingredients for the marinade. 26 years ago, she had been the promising literary scholar, the one professor spoke about with excitement. Robert had been the supportive boyfriend then, proud of her accomplishments, eager to discuss her research over late-night coffee. Somewhere along the way, through relocations for his career, through the beautiful chaos of raising children, through the gradual accumulation of domestic responsibilities, she had become background music, pleasant, necessary for atmosphere, but rarely the focus of anyone's attention. The doorbell chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret, her mother-in-law of 23 years, arrived early as usual, immaculately dressed and carrying her signature lemon cake that Eleanor had never been allowed to have the recipe for, despite numerous requests. "Eleanor, darling," Margaret air-kissed both cheeks, her eyes already scanning the kitchen for imperfections. "I came early to see if you needed help, though everything looks perfect as always. Such a talent for domesticity. Some women just have the knack, don't they?" The compliment carried its familiar sting, the implication that domesticity was Eleanor's natural domain rather than a skill set she developed while setting aside other talents. Margaret placed her cake at the center of the dessert table, subtly adjusting Eleanor's careful arrangement. "Robert tells me Michael has been offered that prestigious clerkship. You must be so proud, all that intelligence. Must come from his father's side, all those legal minds." Eleanor nodded, swallowing the correction that wanted to escape, that her own father had been a respected constitutional scholar, that Michael's analytical skills reflected her influence as much as Robert's prose and Esentin. Instead, she smiled and poured Margaret's tea into the cup with the invisible hairline crack, the one that always leaked slowly onto the sleeve. An accident, of course. As the evening unfolded, Eleanor orchestrated the dinner party with graceful precision, remembering colleague spouses' names, refilling wine glasses, guiding conversation through potential awkward moments. Robert held court at the table's head, sharing anecdotes about his recent investment victories. Eleanor noticed how he introduced her to new colleagues. "And this is Eleanor, the secret to my success. Keeps everything running so I can focus on work." A compliment wrapped around an erasure. Later, as she loaded the dishwasher while guests enjoyed coffee in the living room, Eleanor overheard snippets of conversation. "Robert's wife seems lovely," someone commented. "What does she do?" The question hung momentarily before Robert responded with a chuckle. "Everything that matters at home." Eleanor's kingdom is the domestic sphere, and she rules it perfectly. Laughter followed, appreciative and dismissive simultaneously. The awakening began on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable except for the certified letter addressed to Eleanor. Opening it, she discovered that Robert had refinanced their home, the home she had spent 20 years perfecting, to invest in his brother's business venture. When confronted, his confusion seemed genuine. "I didn't think you'd be interested in the details," he said, as if discussing something trivial rather than the financial security she had helped build over 2 decades of careful management. That same week, at Elise's promotion celebration, Eleanor stood by the hors d'oeuvres table, pride swelling for her accomplished daughter. She overheard Elise telling colleagues about her upbringing. Pretty traditional setup, dad the breadwinner, mom never really worked. But she was always there, you know? Team mom, volunteer, the whole perfect homemaker thing. The casual erasure of Eleanor's academic background and the years she spent editing Robert's presentations and ghostwriting articles under his name created a heaviness in her chest that made it difficult to maintain her smile. Michael needed emergency financial help for law school housing, but called his father instead of her, despite Eleanor managing the family finances for decades. When she offered advice during the speakerphone conversation, he politely thanked her but waited for Robert's confirmation before proceeding. "Dad knows how these things work," he explained later, apparently forgetting that Eleanor had orchestrated every major family purchase, investment, and financial decision while Robert provided the income. That night, Eleanor stood in the guest bathroom, staring at her reflection. When had she become this careful arrangement of features designed to please others? When had her opinions transformed from valued insights to polite suggestions easily overlooked? The pattern became impossible to ignore. Her family consulted her about meal preparations and holiday logistics, but excluded her from meaningful decisions. They praised her support while systematically undermining her agency. The following month brought a series of small humiliations that crystallized Eleanor's growing awareness. At a dinner with Robert's partners, she began sharing her perspective on a literary adaptation everyone was discussing. Robert interrupted with a gentle hand on her arm. "Eleanor hasn't seen the film yet. She's been so busy with her garden club." She had not only seen the film, but had read the original novel years ago as part of her graduate studies. The conversation moved on, her contribution erased. When the library board where she volunteered suggested she take on a leadership role in the children's literacy program, Margaret commented during Sunday brunch, "How sweet that they value your little hobby. Though I always thought with your education, you'd do something more substantial. But I suppose at this stage, it's nice to have a little project." Robert nodded absently, scrolling through his phone. Michael and Elise exchanged glances that Eleanor couldn't interpret but felt acutely. Eleanor retreated inward, spending more time at the library where her opinions were valued, her knowledge respected. She began keeping a journal, documenting incidents that once she would have dismissed as misunderstandings. She found herself lingering in the attic, opening boxes of her academic papers, awards, and letters of recommendation from professors who had once seen such promise in her. One evening, preparing dinner alone again, she realized she'd been crying silently, the tears falling into the pasta sauce. She caught her reflection in the kitchen window, a ghost moving through routines that no longer served any purpose beyond habit. That night, she wrote a letter she never intended to send, addressing her family with all the accumulated hurts and disappointments. "I have become invisible to you," she wrote, "not through your malice, but through my compliance. I surrendered my voice so gradually that none of us noticed its disappearance." The act of naming her pain brought clarity. She had become complicit in her own erasure. The weight of realization pressed Eleanor into her chair, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For 20 years, she had poured herself into creating the perfect environment for her family to thrive, and they had thrived spectacularly. Robert's career had soared with her behind-the-scenes support. Elise and Michael had grown into confident, accomplished adults under her nurturing. Everyone had flourished in the greenhouse of her attention, everyone except Eleanor herself, who had been slowly suffocating beneath the weight of others' expectations and her own acquiescence. Eleanor stared at the family photo on her desk, her slightly off-center, everyone else in sharp focus. The woman in that picture wasn't truly her. It was a carefully constructed persona designed to meet everyone's needs but her own. When had she last pursued something solely because it interested her? When had she last expressed an opinion without first calculating its reception? When had she last felt fully seen by the people who claimed to love her most? The next morning arrived with unusual clarity. Eleanor made breakfast as always, but declined a last-minute request to host Robert's colleagues for dinner. "I have plans," she said simply, offering no explanation, leaving him to handle the arrangements himself. The bewilderment on his face might have been comical in another context, as if a reliable appliance had suddenly developed independence. Eleanor drove to the university that afternoon and requested information about their master's program in library science. Using money from an inheritance her mother had left her years ago, funds she'd been saving for an emergency, she enrolled in fall classes. When Margaret learned of this decision during their monthly lunch and commented that it seemed indulgent at her age, Eleanor responded with unexpected directness. "Actually, I think it's long overdue." The conversation stalled as Margaret processed this departure from Eleanor's usual deference. At the library, Eleanor befriended Sophia, a retired professor who recognized her intellectual capability immediately. Through Sophia, she connected with a community of women who had reinvented themselves midlife. Their stories of divorces, career changes, health challenges overcome, put her own situation in perspective. These women spoke of reclamation rather than rebellion, of remembering rather than reinventing. "We don't become new people," Sophia told her over coffee. "We remember who we were before we started shaping ourselves to fit other people's expectations." When Elise needed help with a major presentation and assumed Eleanor would drop everything to assist, Eleanor set a boundary. "I can help you Tuesday evening," she offered, maintaining her commitment to her own class. Elise's surprise turned to respect when Eleanor's limited time yielded more focused, valuable input than her previous open-ended availability ever did. "You're really good at this, Mom," she said, studying the restructured presentation. "You should consider doing this professionally." Eleanor didn't mention that she once had that many of her father's successful pitches had been refined through her editorial eye. Eleanor transformed the guest room into her study space, moving her grandmother's desk from the attic, replacing Margaret's gifted decor with items that held personal meaning. She hung her diplomas on the wall, documents that had been stored in tubes for decades. When Robert questioned the changes, she explained matter-of-factly that she needed a dedicated workspace for her program. His discomfort was evident, but so was his reluctance to directly challenge her reasonable request. The family dynamics shifted, initially with confusion and resistance, then with tentative adaptation. Michael began sending her his legal briefs, genuinely valuing her editorial perspective rather than seeking superficial approval. Robert, finding himself handling more household responsibilities, oscillated between resentment and a grudging appreciation for all she'd managed invisibly for years. "I never realized how much you do," he admitted one evening, after struggling to coordinate dinner and laundry simultaneously. Halfway through her first semester, Eleanor arrived home to find Robert in the kitchen, attempting to prepare dinner, something he hadn't done in years. "I thought you might be tired after class," he explained, somewhat defensively. The gesture, imperfect as it was, represented a crack in the established order. That night, they talked more honestly than they had in years. "I don't understand what's happening," he confessed. "It's like you're becoming someone else." "I'm not becoming someone else," Eleanor corrected gently. "I'm remembering who I was before I became only what everyone needed me to be." She saw in his eyes a flicker of recognition, remembrance of the woman he'd fallen in love with, whose intellect had once challenged and excited him. The true test came at Thanksgiving, when Eleanor announced she wouldn't be handling all preparations as usual. "I've created a sign-up sheet," she explained to the family. "Everyone's responsible for certain dishes and tasks." The resistance was immediate. Margaret's horror, Robert's confusion, the children's uncertainty. "But you always do Thanksgiving," Margaret protested. "It's your thing." "It was never my thing," Eleanor clarified. "It was my responsibility because no one else would take it on. This year, we share or we simplify." Standing firm against their collective expectation felt like pushing against a massive weight, but with each moment she held her ground, breathing became easier. Thanksgiving arrived with imperfection, dishes served at different times, seating arrangements less than optimal, Margaret's running commentary on the changed traditions. Yet something unexpected emerged from the chaos: genuine conversation, laughter, and a new appreciation for the complexity of creating the seamless holidays Eleanor had always managed alone. Michael and Elise, initially reluctant participants, found themselves defending the new approach when Margaret became particularly critical. As winter deepened, Eleanor received an unexpected call, an offer to coordinate the library's adult education program, creating a bridge between her academic background and practical community needs. The position came with respect, appropriate compensation, and recognition of her capabilities. When she shared the news at dinner, the family's reactions revealed how far they'd come. Genuine congratulations from Elise, thoughtful questions from Michael and from Robert, a complex mix of pride and adjustment. At Christmas, Eleanor hosted dinner, but with adjusted expectations, everyone contributed, shared in setup and cleanup. When Margaret arrived with her lemon cake and criticized the less formal arrangement, Eleanor simply smiled and said, "This works better for us now." She served herself the first slice of cake and enjoyed it without apology. In January, Eleanor completed her first semester with distinction. The family had adjusted to her transformation, not without friction, but with growing recognition of her as an individual with legitimate needs and aspirations. Robert, initially defensive, had begun to see how their relationship calcified into rigid roles that limited them both. A tentative new partnership emerged as they negotiated shared responsibilities rather than defaulting to gendered expectations. "I think I stopped seeing you as the woman I fell in love with, the one who challenged me intellectually," Robert admitted one evening as they sat in the study she had claimed for herself. Eleanor considered this, running her fingers along the edge of her grandmother's desk. "She never left. You just stopped looking for her." At the launch event for her library program, Eleanor addressed a room full of community members, articulating her vision for accessible education with confidence and clarity. She caught sight of herself in a window reflection, a woman standing straight, no longer slightly off-center, commanding attention not through demand but through presence. That evening, she found the letter she had written during her darkest moment. Many of the hurts remained true, but they no longer defined her. She didn't need to send it. Her actions had spoken more eloquently than her words could have. Eleanor understood now that her worth had never actually been in question, only her willingness to claim it. The family gathered for Eleanor's graduation ceremony that spring. As she crossed the stage, she saw them in the audience. Really saw them, not as the people who had diminished her, but as flawed individuals who were learning, as she had, that relationships require continuous renegotiation to remain vital. Elise had asked for her guidance developing a mentorship program for junior women at her company. Michael spoke proudly of his mother's academic pursuits to friends and colleagues. Even Margaret had developed a grudging respect for Eleanor's quiet determination. Eleanor realized that reclaiming herself hadn't required dramatic confrontation or severing ties. It had required something both simpler and more difficult: the courage to disappoint people who had grown accustomed to her endless accommodation. The quiet revolution of self-reclamation had changed not just how her family saw her, but how she saw herself. As summer approached, Eleanor sat in her garden, watching butterflies navigate between the flowers she had planted years ago. She thought about identity, how easily it could be buried beneath layers of expectation and obligation, and how persistently it survived, waiting for rediscovery. Like her garden, she had continued to grow even when no one was paying attention. The most meaningful victories happen in silence, she reflected, not with dramatic declarations, but with small daily acts of self-recognition. Is there greater freedom than becoming the author of your own story? For Eleanor Wells, the answer had become clear. The woman who had once moved through her own life like a ghost had reclaimed her substance through quiet persistence. Her family had not lost her. They had gained a fuller version of her, one who could love them more authentically because she had remembered how to value herself. Some battles are won not with power, but with dignity. If you found yourself slowly disappearing within your own life, would you have the courage to become visible again?